So let's talk about JavaScript, the language that brought behavior to the web. So back in the 1990s, Netscape was in full-on competitive mode, and they were trying to stay ahead of Microsoft. And one of their moves was to make the web interactive. So not just clickable, like with anchor tags, but dynamic. And so they came up with this scripting language that could run right inside the web browser and manipulate the web page that the user was looking at in real time. And that language was originally called Mocha. And then briefly they changed the name to LiveScript. And then yes, finally JavaScript. Now the name JavaScript was pure marketing. Netscape had just made a deal with a company called Sun Microsystems. And Java, something that many of you know about, was the new hot programming language at the time. So they slapped the name JavaScript on this totally unrelated language to kind of ride the hype that led to a ton of confusion. And that, by the way, that still causes problems today. But you need to know that JavaScript has nothing to do with Java. Not then, not now, and not to put too sharp a point on it, but there'll be a question about that on the final exam, so please don't get that wrong. So anyway, Netscape added JavaScript support to their Netscape Navigator 2.0 web browser without any standard process, without any coordination with the W3C, because it was a classic case of move fast, ship something, and let the rest of the world figure it out. And it gave Netscape another marketing bullet point, that our browser is dynamic, and you, that is the web developer, can build interactive pages. They advertised literally like, we have DHTML. And of course, Microsoft wasn't going to let that slide, so they reverse engineered the language and released their own implementation for Internet Explorer version 3, because this was the era of fragmentation, and they couldn't use the name JavaScript due to Netscape's branding. So they just called their version JScript. So now we had two different scripting engines, each behaving a little differently with no standards in sight, which meant that you, as a web developer, and if you wanted to write JavaScript in the late 1990s, you had to test your code in both browsers, because what worked in Netscape might not work in Internet Explorer, and vice versa. So sound familiar? Because that was the state of things until about 1997, when a standards organization called ECMA International stepped in. ECMA stands for the European Computer Manufacturers Association. So ECMA worked with both Netscape and Microsoft and some others to define a formal standard of the language, and that language was called ECMAScript. And a version of ECMAScript version 1 was published in 1997. So if you've ever wondered why people sometimes refer to JavaScript as ECMAScript in like official specs or documentation, that's why. It's the standardized version of what Netscape created. And just to be clear, the W3C didn't create or standardize JavaScript, because that was handled by ECMA International, but the W3C did play a role, an important supporting role, as JavaScript became more common. And we started, as developers, we started using it more in our web pages. So the W3C focused on defining how it should interact with other technologies like HTML and CSS, especially through something called the Document Object Model, or DOM, which is something in their purview. So while they didn't shape the language themselves, they helped define the scripts and how the scripts would reliably access and manipulate content on a web page across different web browsers. And that effort led to a formal definition of the DOM, which is something that we rely on heavily today whenever JavaScript interacts with a web page. So when we talk about JavaScript interacting with a web page, what we're really talking about is the DOM, the Document Object Model. So that's when a browser loads an HTML document, it turns that document into a structured tree-like representation in memory. Every element, so think object, like a heading, a paragraph, an image, becomes a node in that tree. So JavaScript can then access, modify, add, or remove those nodes however you want it to go. And that's how it can change the content, the layout, or behavior of a web page in real time without needing to reload the whole thing. So now, before we dive into writing JavaScript ourselves, let me just quickly clarify where this code actually runs. So when you write JavaScript code, it goes on the web server right along with your HTML, CSS, and all your other assets like images or videos. It's just like any other file, usually with a .js extension. And that file is what the web server software hands over when a browser requests your web page. So like your other code, it travels over the internet via HTTP and lands in the user's browser. So what's important here is that you need to know that JavaScript isn't compiled ahead of time. It stays in plain text form just as you wrote it. It's readable, editable, and when it hits the browser interprets the code on the fly. And the execution happens entirely in the browser itself. And that's a key distinction because when JavaScript runs what we call client side, it can't do things like, server side things like send email or write to a shared database or process credit card transactions. Those are server side tasks. And JavaScript can ask the server to do those things through an API or a form submission, but it doesn't have that kind of power on its own. It's strictly operating within the browser environment on the computer or device that's sitting in front of your user. Anyway, from there, JavaScript slowly began to mature. The browser wars didn't make things easy, but over time, developers like us pushed for more consistency, and browser makers started caring, just a little about interoperability. And JavaScript became more than a gimmick, for drop-downs and hover effects. It became more of an essential part of web development. And that shift didn't happen overnight. For much of the early 2000s, JavaScript was still kind of used sparingly and often reluctantly because of the browser inconsistencies and also a reputation for being unreliable. But things changed around 2005 with the rise of something called AJAX. That's AJAX, which stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which we'll talk about later. But just to be clear, AJAX isn't a new language or a separate technology unto itself. It's just a technique that allows web pages to update their content by exchanging small amounts of data with the server in the background without requiring a full page reload. And that was a turning point because suddenly developers could build interfaces that felt more like desktop apps. They were faster, smoother, and more responsive. And so back in 2005, sites like Gmail and Google Maps and back then it was Facebook, showed what was possible. And from that point on, JavaScript became something that you had to know if you were building for the web. Now, just to be clear, keep in mind that programming with AJAX means that you, the developer, have to work on both sides of the client-server connection, using JavaScript to send instructions back to the web server and then programming that server to capture that information and do something with that data. And that goes a little above and beyond what we can do in this course, but keep in mind a lot of what we have, in our school here is a lot of downstream courses that pick up right at that point. So you might want to look into that when you get a chance. And that's where we are now on the client side of the user experience, and that's where we'll stay in this course because we've got the structure of our pages written in HTML, and we've got the presentation layer handled by CSS, and now we're going to start working with JavaScript, which is the behavior layer that makes things move and respond and change right in the web browser without having to reload the page. So as we shift to this new topic, we're going to start experimenting with what JavaScript can do and how it fits into the broader picture of the web development lifecycle. Not to turn you into JavaScript experts, because that's not the goal of this course, but we just want you to understand the purpose of the language and the history behind it and how to start using it to bring a little more life into your pages. So let's get into it.